Three, two, one, here we go. Rainman's Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. Just want to give a quick shout out to everybody watching. Thank you very much. I know you're going to find this next interview thought-provoking. I enjoy spending time with people like my next guest and getting into more detail about the subject matter. And I know you appreciate that as well. So go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe. That way we can continue bringing you great content in the future. So thanks again for being part of Rain Man's Take and enjoy the interview. Welcome back my guest, Joe Connell. Joe, how are you, sir?
Very well. Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for having me back. This is a great pleasure for me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So if you all remember, I've had Joe on a couple of times. He's a noted historian and author, and he focuses on Irish history, and what we're going to be talking about today, early 20th century Irish history during the War of Independence against Britain. And Joe has written several books on the subject. And one of the first interviews I did with Joe was regarding the book he had written at the time called The Shadow War, Michael Collins and the Politics of Violence. And that was a great interview. And then I had Joe back on actually to talk about the historic character of St. Patrick. And that was actually a really, really enjoyable conversation as well. Joe has recently come out with a new book. It came out last November, and it's called The Terror War, The Uncomfortable Realities of the War of Independence. And so I wanted to have Joe back on to talk about that. And why don't we just start with how things have been since you and I last spoke?
Thank you, Brian. As I say, that the new book came out in November. It is called The Terror War. It does expand on some of the things that talked about in the Shadow War, particularly the War of Independence. And when we talk today, and we talked last time, all kinds of guerrilla wars, really all wars alike. They're quite similar, and yet they're all different. So you'll see similarities as we talk today about things that are happening right now, just as you saw similarities to the things that you were seeing in Afghanistan or Iraq when you were serving in the military. They're exactly the same, and yet they're all different. One of the things about this year is that this is the 100th anniversary of the killing of Michael Collins in August of 1922. So I'll be going to Ireland in July to talk about that somewhat. And there's a great deal of interest in that. Obviously, he was a man that had a huge influence on the War of Independence and the Civil War thereafter, but he's had a great deal of influence on Ireland in the last 100 years as well. So all those kinds of things, I think, fit quite well into a conversation we can have and go from there.
Okay, before we go any further, where can people find these books? So there's the Terror War, there's the Shadow War, and then you have several other books about sort of the early 20th century Irish history. Do you have a website, or is it primarily on Amazon where people can find these books?
You can find them all on Amazon. The quickest way, the easiest way is for most of the books, you go to Wordwell Press. It's one word, WORDWELL Press.
Okay.
And they'll get all the books to you. There's several there. Also, I have some books with Kilmainham Tales, and I'll spell that too. It's KILMAINHAM, and Michal O'Divla will get you all the books that you want there. So it's very easy to do it. They will send the books to you very quickly. And if you go onto their websites, you'll be able to take a look and see all the books that are available.
And that's actually a couple things. One, as I was prepping for this conversation today, reading on the terror war, I couldn't help but, I mean, it's in the news right now in the Ukraine. And so it's very timely. Unfortunately, terrorism and that type of warfare is timeless, and it's used pretty much all the time when there's conflict. So we'll definitely get into that. But one of the things I wanted to, as I was reading this, and this kind of little bit of ignorance here, but I never realized that Michael Collins was that big of a character in the modern Irish story. And one of the questions I did have was, what was Michael Collins before the War of Independence started? Was he a popular figure before that, or did the war make him this popular figure, this sort of legendary figure that we know of now?
Michael Collins came from a very large family in County Cork. In those days, it was a farming family. It was a very typical kind of a family there. His father was 75 years old when he married his mother, who was 23. They had 8 children. Michael Collins was the last of the 8 children, and his father died when Michael was 6 years old. And when he was dying on his deathbed, his father had the family come around him, and he said, "Take care of this young man, Michael. He'll be a great man for Ireland, and he'll do great things for Ireland." When you take a look at his background, his father was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which had been established in 1858 in order to try and get Ireland their own independence. He was very much of a participant in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But Michael went to school in Clonakilty, and his teacher was a man named Dennis Lyons, who was also a member of the IRB. That was very unusual at that time for such a teacher, a civilian teacher, to be teaching the history of Ireland, not the history of Great Britain. And when Michael got out of school, like all young kids in that area, in a farming area, he went over to the town smithy, a man by the name of James Santry. And they would hang around there. They would help Santry with his chores. He was a member of the IRB, and leaning against the wall in the smithy shop were the pikes that were used in 1798 in the Rising. So you can say that Michael Collins' post-education started very early in his life. But then he went to London. He became, he did just as a lot of Irish kids did. They went there, they went to London, they went there for jobs, to work. He joined the IRB himself. He came back. He was in the Rising of 1916 as a staff captain. He really was nothing more than an aide-de-camp to one of the signatories to the proclamation, Joseph Plunkett. He was not very important. He went off to Frongog prison. He showed his administrative ability in Frongog prison, and I think that's where this story kind of starts, really. Most of the books about Michael Collins talk about him and talk about his military career. No one at the time thought of him as a soldier. They thought of him certainly as a military planner. They thought of him certainly as a fighter, but not as a soldier. But he said of himself that I'm a soldier and not a politician. No one wanted to be called a politician in those days. So he didn't give himself, I think, credit as much as he should have at the time. But in fact, in my view, he was neither a soldier, and we'll get to that when we get to his killing, nor was he a politician. He was an administrative genius. I view Collins in the like of a modern day CEO of a multinational corporation, the kind that's making tires in one country and making electronic parts in another corporation. He ran the entire revolution as a multi-organizational CEO, and he did that entirely through the War of Independence, through the treaty negotiations, through the post-treaty period, the treaty debates, and then in the Civil War. Remember, he had a multitude of occupations there in the War of Independence time, and they were central. His centrality of importance was there in all of them. He was the Minister for Finance. He was the Director of Intelligence. He was the Adjutant General of the Irish Army. He was the President of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And yet, that romantic military aspect of Collins is the one that's still remembered. And if you look at pictures on book covers, etc., it's almost always in a uniform in some way and showing him as a military officer. He was an administrator, not a soldier.
And that's actually very interesting because when you sent me a copy of The Terror War, you also sent me a copy of one of your essays, part of your Kilmainham Tales, and it's called "Who Shot Michael Collins?" And it's basically talks about the facts, the theories, and sort of the legend that came about after the ambush that killed him in August of 1922. And it's funny because in that little book, that's exactly what he figured himself as a warrior. You know, there's that quote that he says to his partner, "Hey, if they hit us tonight, we're going to fight it out with them," type of thing. So it's very interesting. I wouldn't say I wouldn't say it's even bravado. It's just that's what he thought of himself more as the warrior. But it seems like history sort of has him pegged as sort of the mastermind of the intelligence group and just kind of running the overall revolution.
In the treaty debates, Arthur Griffith, who was the chairman of the group that went over to negotiate the treaty, and he was one of the leaders of Sinn Féin. He was one of the politicians. He was one who conceptualized things and put things together. He said of Michael Collins in the treaty debates that Michael Collins was the man who won the war. That got a lot of catcalls at the time. As you well know, no one ever wins a war. No one person does. Now, it can be said that one person loses a war, but it can't be said that one person won the war. He was extraordinarily important. And if you try and break it down and you say, okay, who would have taken over in the Ministry of Finance if he wasn't there? Who would have taken over as Director of Intelligence if he wasn't there? You can find some of the next men up, if you will, to use that sort of a phrase, but you're not going to find anyone who would fit into all of those particular positions as well as Michael Collins did.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and you could say that in all the conflicts in history, there's that sort of that bigger than life kind of personality, or that person that everyone's like, that guy he can do everything, and there seems to always be one of those in history, and Michael Collins is a version of that at the time.
I smile because he certainly thought that. In the sense that if there was ever anything that he saw was in the brief of another person in the cabinet or somebody else, and he wanted to get it done, he'd simply jump on it. So while he had a tremendous amount of loyalty that attached to him because of what he did, he also was able to have a great amount of enmity attached to him as well, because people didn't like the fact that he was taking over. His name, for the most part, they called him the big fella. Now, his family said that when he was a little boy, they called him that because he would always get the biggest pail. He would always try and do things, even when he was a little tiny tot. But he got the name the big fella in Frongok, not because he was so big physically. He was about 6 feet tall. He weighed about 200 pounds. He was an imposing man, but he wasn't that big that he would get that name. He got the name the big fella because many of the people there thought he was too big for his britches. And they thought that, in fact, this guy will say and do anything. And he would have thought that through his entire life as well.
All right, so that's a very interesting segue into my next question. And when I was reading this is the one thing that really stuck out to me, because obviously when the Civil War broke out after the treaty was signed, obviously half of the country was pissed at what the treaty said. Obviously, Michael Collins was pro-treaty. What was in the treaty? Why was he so happy with it? And was he being played by the English? Because you always hear the English say, if they do this, if they do X, Y, Z, we're going right back in.
Well, I'm not sure that you can say he was extremely happy with it. I think you should say he thought it was the best that could be done at the time. The treaty was signed on the 6th of December, 1921. It was the Anglo-Irish Treaty. It did end the War of Independence. Now, in the summer of 1921, there was a truce. In 11th of July, 1921, the war had really come to the point of a stalemate, and both sides knew this. When we talked about the Shadow War, we talked about the fact that there's three prongs, if you will, to that war. There's the military, there's the political, and there's the propaganda. The military, it was really kind of a stalemate, although both sides were killing each other. From a political point of view, the world looked terribly upon the British at this point, because the Irish had a great propaganda situation going on throughout the world. And so therefore, the British got to a point where they had to find a way to solve this problem. And you cannot solve any problem now. You can't solve it then, and you won't ever be able to solve it in the future. You can't solve a political problem with military force. They finally realized that. And so for them, it was a face-saving thing. How do we get out of our problem in Ireland and save our face in doing so? For the Irish, they simply wanted the war to end, and they wanted separation from Great Britain, but they wanted it a little bit more than the British were willing to give them. Remember, the British had the biggest empire in the world at that time. They controlled about 20% of the landmass in the entire world. There is a saying that even God, that basically that the British were everywhere in the entire world. And the saying was that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And you may have heard that the second line to that saying is that's because God won't even trust those bastards in the dark. So the fact of the matter is the Irish wanted out of that situation. They were not going to get some things, any treaty, any solving of any kind of a problem politically is going to involve compromise on both sides. For the British, they had to find as well a way to save face as well as they could. The Irish had to get as much as they could, and they wanted the fighting to stop. They got Dominion status, which put them in the same status as, for example, Canada, but they had to remain within the British Empire. It was called Commonwealth for the very first time in those treaty negotiations. It did allow the 6 northern counties to opt out of the treaty, which they did after 1 month. And so those who were opposed to the treaty, they were called the anti-treaty IRA. They fought that civil war to try and abrogate the treaty and just start all over again. Their biggest objection was to an oath. But it's a great misconception in Ireland to this day that there was an oath to the king in that treaty. There was an oath of allegiance. That's not true. There was never an oath of allegiance to the king. There was an oath of allegiance to the Irish Constitution and an oath of faithfulness to the monarch. And there's a huge difference diplomatically between allegiance and faithfulness. Allegiance denotes obeyance. We will obey you. When you have an oath of faithfulness, it's we will go along with you if we want to. Now, when they had the treaty debates, they were the most vituperative debates you can ever imagine. Names were called, everything but rocks were thrown. It was absolutely terrible. But there were a moment or two in there, as there would be in Ireland, where a man stood up and he tried to say, this is the difference between allegiance and faithfulness. He said, when you get married, you promise to be faithful to your wife. You don't promise to obey her. And someone in the back stood up and said, wait till you get married. So the fact of the matter is, the treaty was fought over the oath. It was not fought over partition, and it was not fought over some of the other things. It was simply fought over the oath and the fact the anti-treaty people really wanted to say, let's get rid of the treaty, we'll go back and we'll fight the British some more and we'll get more out of it. And that was simply not going to happen.
Well, and that would have been the foregone conclusion if the IRA side of the Civil War won. The British were already ready to go back in if the treaty was getting ripped up.
The British were not only ready to go back in, they were in. They were still there, and they were. But there was something that Collins realized and an awful lot of the anti-treaty people didn't realize. The British at this time might have had what's called imperial overstretch. We know we've talked before about the fact that the British were in the new mandated territories in the Near East. They were in Germany. They were all around the world. They had that huge empire. But the British had the ability to bring in 100,000 soldiers. The IRA did not. At no time was the IRA actually able to put more than about 3,000 soldiers in the field. The IRA simply could not fight straight on with the British, and they would have lost. So that's where Collins knew when he went to do negotiation, he probably knew better than anybody else in the country exactly what the military status of the IRA was.
Yeah, and that great transition right into the next phase of this conversation, which will get us eventually to the main meat of the book, and that is the ambush that killed Collins. And go ahead and give me your take on it, because you go through everything. You go through all the theories, all the conspiracy theories. You actually, the first couple of pages are great because they give just the facts. This is what happened, X, Y, Z. And I'd love to get your take on that, because that feeds right into the terror war. Political assassination essentially is part of terrorism.
Yeah, let's talk about what happened here. The Civil War started at the end of June 1922. Some of the anti-treaty forces had taken over buildings in Dublin. There was conflict back and forth. Collins, in his capacity as a CEO, as I mentioned earlier, was dealing with the people on the other side. He was constantly always trying to make a deal in Ireland. That's always what we want to do. He was trading weapons with them. He was saying, I'll get new weapons from the British, but I can't put them into the field they would be traceable to us. I'll give them to you. You give me your old weapons, and then you send these to the North, and they can fight up there. He was constantly trying to make deals. That all blew up in June when there was a man named Field Marshal Henry Wilson who was killed in London. He was an advisor to the North, and the North was involved in some great sectarian pogroms at the time. And some of the people thought that was Collins the one who ordered this? Were the people who just did it themselves? Did they order it? Did the people who were in the four courts, the anti-treaty forces, order it? Nobody knew, and nobody knows today. But the British said the four courts people did. The anti-treaty people did. If you don't get them out, we will. They gave orders to their general to attack there, which would have started the war up again. Collins couldn't allow that. He had to attack the four courts, and that's how the Civil War started on the 28th of June, 1922. During that period between June of 22 and August of 22, Collins is still trying to make a deal with everybody. He's trying to talk to both sides. He's involved in sending things north. He's involved in everything that there is. He would tell one person one thing, another person another thing. He kept a notebook in his pocket all his life, and you'd wonder how many things did he have to write down to keep track of what he told somebody, because he was telling everybody whatever they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Then as the war is progressing, the pro-treaty forces really took over. They kicked the anti-treaty forces out of Dublin. The anti-treaty forces were pretty much forced into the southwestern corner of Ireland in County Cork. And that's when Collins decided that he was going to go down to County Cork, his home county, because he had some things he wanted to do. He wanted to check with some people there about getting some money back that the anti-treaty forces had put in banks. He wanted to also see if he couldn't talk to some of the leaders down there and maybe bring about some kind of a settlement that would give saving face again to both sides. This was very important all the way through there, that both sides had to save face, whatever they did. That's why he went down there in August of 1922.
And so the theory, I guess, at least my understanding of it, the sort of probably the mainstream theory is it was an ambush by the anti-treaty forces, very well coordinated. That's what killed him. Now, when the actual bullets started flying, now there's a huge question of whether or not it was accidental fire, if he was killed by somebody in his own party, or if it was in fact actually one of the anti-treaty forces. So what do modern Irishmen think happened?
All of those.
Really? Okay. So it's just one big soup.
When you take a look at what happens in history, it's not very often that we're absolutely sure about how things happen. Often in history, there are gaps, and we're always trying to connect the dots. But that's not just history. That's in our own lives, in our own relationships. Anybody who's ever gone out on a Saturday night with $50 in their pocket and awoke on Sunday morning with nothing but a hangover knows that there are gaps in relationships. But that doesn't mean that you flew to the moon that night and came back. It just means we got to figure out what happened. Nobody in Ireland knows exactly what happened, and I don't think anybody in Ireland is ever going to know exactly what happened. But where there are things that we can be pretty sure of that we kind of agree upon. First of all, the ambush was set up that day, that morning. He went through a town. They recognized the fact that it was a convoy coming through there that was very, very poorly constructed. And they said, if they come back this way, we're going to ambush them. Why'd they say they're going to come back this way? Simple. All the roads in that area had been blocked or bridges blown up or trees down in order to protect the people who were at a meeting that was going on there. They knew that they went down there if they were going to come back the same way. How do we know that? Well, I think that the anti-treaty forces told us. There were about 35 or 40 people in the ambush rotating through in the course of a day. If you were going to rotate 35 or 40 people in an ambush and you thought that there was a possibility of 2 or 3 or 4 places to ambush him, would you put all your men in one place? Or would you put him in 3 or 4 different places? They put everybody in the same place. They told us that this is the way he had to come back. The ambushers told us that. So the fact that he came back the same way, to me, was indicated by the way the ambush was set up. And by the time the ambush came off in the late evening, about 7:30 at night, most of them had given up. Most of them thought, well, maybe he's not coming back at all today. They started to break down the ambush. They took the mines out of the road. They started taking the cart away. And there were only about 5 people out of the 35 left there. They fired some shots. Then they were trying to get away. It was getting dark. It was getting misty. It was very, very poor visibility. And so that's it. So from this point forward, though, it's like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle with no picture on the box. We have all the pieces, but we don't know exactly how they fit together. There were a lot of anomalies, if you will. There was no inquest. The actual records from the hospital were taken away. And later on in 1932, material when the government changed over from one party to the other, material was taken away by the new party. There's been a debate over the exact nature of the wound. There's been debate over who shot him and why, or who really would have benefited. So there's a tremendous number of anomalies here that we really can't say for sure exactly what's going on. And then that leads us to the conspiracy theories that are just rampant and have been. In 1958, Rex Taylor wrote a book called The Assassination of Michael Collins. That was about the first time the books started to be written about Michael Collins and looked into the assassination. Since that time, there have been a myriad of books, all writing about this with all kinds of theories. And let me just point out a few of these. The anti-treaty forces in county court knew he was coming to town and lured him into a trap. There was a junta in the cabinet. They didn't like him anymore, so they were going to have him shot in conjunction with the British Secret Service. He was killed by his general, Emmett Dalton, who was sitting next to him in the car in the Rising, who was one of his most favorite people. De Valera went to London for the treaty negotiations, and he said, I can't get a Republican. Lloyd George says, well, you don't come. Send Collins. I'll get rid of him, and then we'll take care of everything for you, and we'll have Collins' head on a platter. There were anti-treaty elements in the IRB that didn't like him, so they had a trial in 1966, kind of hard because the IRB was dissolved in 1924, but they did have a trial that these people looked to and say, see, he was condemned to death by the IRB. The British Secret Service always wanted to kill him, so they finally got him. They hired a German sniper who got him at this particular point on this particular road. There is no shortage of conspiracy theories, and just the concepts here, as I say, that's like flying to the moon on your Sunday morning. It's just a lot of these just don't make sense. Yeah. They probably couldn't have happened. Now, remember, the only witnesses are a few Free State soldiers and a few anti-treaty soldiers. They have different stories, and they never talk very much about anybody. Remember something else, though. Even at the time when Michael Collins died, the anti-treaty people didn't like him for what he took, but he was revered by most of the people in Ireland who had fought in the war. On the very day that he died, Tom Barry, who led some of the big raids there as a flying column leader in County Court, was in Kilmainham Jail in Dublin. And he said when the news went around that 1,000 prisoners in Kilmainham Jail, all anti-treaty prisoners, got down on their knees and started saying the rosary. So the man who would have said, I shot Michael Collins, he probably wouldn't have had a very long life, and his family would have been just vilified for the rest of it. Yeah. So the fact that we don't know a few things, to me, doesn't mean that we can extrapolate into nowhere. All these theories are speculations, and they're all heavy on motive, but not really on evidence. Remember, just because an answer is simple doesn't mean it's wrong. There's a philosophical principle called Occam's razor. The simplest is the easiest, it's the best. It works in history sometimes just as well as anything else.
Yeah. It may not make the best story, but it might be the truth.
It probably works. And the very first book that was written on Collins was by a man named Piers Beasley, who was one of his friends in the Civil War. He was asked to put the book together by the Collins family. Most people think it was hagiography. However, in his book, what he says is it would appear that Michael Collins was killed by a stray parting shot by someone in the anti-treaty party who was leaving and wasn't taking very careful aim at the time. Yeah. That's probably as close to the truth as we're going to get. And I think that that's probably the truth of the matter, what happened. Yeah. Let me just say one final thing here about this. We started out talking about Collins, the soldier. Collins, the soldier in this ambush, not only, as you said, stand here, we'll fight them, which everybody knows is the exact wrong thing to do in an ambush. You want to get the hell out of the killing zone and get out of there. He not only did that, but he stood up in the middle of a road and pointed and said, there, lads, they're running. Let's go get them. And he was firing from a standing position in the middle of the road when he was shot. No soldier would ever do that. Not even the rawest recruit would ever do that. So that's why the stories are still going around exactly what is happening. Nobody really is going to ever be able to tell for sure.
Yeah. That just you're just telling about that reminds me. I grew up in Acton, Massachusetts. Acton was right next to Concord and Lexington during the Revolution, and when the British were moving towards Concord, the Acton militia was activated. They ran up and reinforced the Concord militia at the Old North Bridge, and the first officer killed in the Revolution was the captain of the Acton militia. And same thing, ran across a wide open field, screaming with his sword out open, and just got taken right out. So real quick, before we get into the Terror War, the book, how long after Collins' murder, or actually after his death, how long after his death did the Civil War last? And then did it end just kind of as an easy truce? It just sort of fizzled out, or did the pro-treaty people eventually win and kind of coalesce the whole country around that?
Well, the Civil War started, as I say, in June of 1922, and by August, the anti-treaty forces have been forced into the Southwest there in County Cork and pretty much down in the province of Munster. By this time, the war was militarily over, and most everybody knew this. Collins knew this, and Collins wanted to go down and talk to some of the people there. Florence O'Donoghue, for example, who ran intelligence in County Cork, as Collins did in Dublin during the War of Independence, was an independent. He was neutral in the Civil War. He wanted to talk to him and see if he could help him out. The fact of the matter is that they didn't really have much chance. Liam Lynch, who was the commander of the anti-treaty forces, was one of the real diehards. He wanted no part of this. Even De Valera, by August of 1922, was trying to bring about some kind of a resolution because he knew that they had made their protests in arms. They were going nowhere. They should stop this. So by August of 22, we never know with the what ifs. We can never tell what's happening. But Collins is still trying to make a deal. He's trying to bring everybody in. He's trying very, very hard to bring this about. After August of 22, the cabinet in Dublin, first of all, told the people in the North, you're on your own. No more of these trading arms, no more anything else. We're on your own. We now have to start our own country down here. And you're on your own to do what you want up there. So that changed. Then you get into September and October, and it just got into a very dirty guerrilla war, even a dirtier guerrilla war, the War of Independence. One of the problems was that both sides had used the very same hidey holes, if you will, during the War of Independence. And one side now thought they could use those, and they couldn't. One side thought they could use a farm for some help, and they couldn't. So the anti-treaty forces didn't have much of a chance at this point. So they simply relied on assassinations, they relied upon burnings, they relied upon killings, beatings, and that sort. By the time November comes, the treaty cabinet in Dublin says we can't put up with this anymore. Now they started having orders to shoot people on sight, and they started getting more and more dirty as it went. That went through November. They had executions, they had non-judicial killings. It was really horrible. They get into January, February, and it kind of peters out. By May of 1923, Liam Lynch is now killed. And at that point, when he's killed, everybody else on the anti-treaty side looks around and says, all right, we don't have a chance. Eamon de Valera, who had no political and absolutely no military authority at this time, writes a letter, tries to get everybody, and says, okay, Legion of the Vanguard, we got to put on our weapons. We'll hold on to them. We'll start this fight somewhere down the road. And the war just kind of ended. There never was a truce agreement. There never was any kind of a finish to the war. But in May of 1923, they laid down their arms. They never turned them in. and you can still see some of these arms hidden in barns and everything else throughout Ireland. And then the war just kind of ended. As far as the terror war that we'll get into here, that carried on from the War of Independence, and certainly the concept of terror in the Civil War, that's still there today. People still feel this one-sidedness. In the elections that they had 3 years ago, you had two parties, the two largest political parties in Ireland. Fianna Fáil, which was the party of De Valera, going all the way through, going back until the time, and Fine Gael, which can trace its roots back to Collins. And for all these years, that's it. For the very first time in history, 3 years ago, those two parties got together in order to form a coalition in the government. And you would see it in newspaper articles, in editorials, in art, everything. Is this the end of Civil War politics? 100 years later. So the fact of the matter is there are still people there who think, no, on that side, our family was this or our family was that or something else. It's still there. It's not what it was, don't get me wrong, but it's still there in people's concept.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's actually fascinating, because is that how is that how the IRA, the historical IRA that we know of, the bombings and the assassinations of the British during the 60s and the 70s, is that that's just kind of an offshoot of that, this war isn't over yet type of thing?
Well, they said so. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a huge change in the Irish historiography, because the IRA in the North was saying, yes, in fact, remember, as you, Brian, said earlier, the anti-treaty forces were saying what was going on in Ireland in 1921. The British could have come back. They had the ability to come back. They had the forces there to come back. In fact, there was a dictatorship that was put in place by Michael Collins. And this dictatorship was what changed everything, and that's the way that the treaty forces went. The historians in 1970 and 80 didn't like that idea, so they had to come up with the concept that it was the Democrats on the Collins side versus the dictators on the anti-treaty side, and that was the fight that there was then. And democracy won. There was no dictators that didn't. That's just not true. And it's not nuanced enough. It's just not even close to true. If you take a look at Michael Collins, it's very easy to say that he was a dictator. He's not a despot. He was not a tyrant. He was not Joe Stalin. Don't get me wrong. But remember, the definition of a dictator started in Rome when they said, we will appoint someone and give him absolute powers in a time of war or in a time of great national necessity. Kind of defines Collins, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So the fact of the matter is, he acted in that way. The anti-treaty forces said they did. When you come to 1960, 70, 80, they're saying we're simply the continuation. And the government in Ireland had to say, no, you're not, because they have to say we are the democratic result of that. There was nothing like this. Now in 2010 and 2015, you're starting to see a little bit more nuance attached to what happened in 1970 and 80, and you're seeing a little more nuance attached to what happened in 1920. Wow. History takes time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you're kind of living right through it, which is really, really interesting. Okay, so here we go. So the book, The Terror War, The Uncomfortable Realities of the War of Independence. And essentially, the kind of the overarching view in my mind was a inferior force, the Irish, versus a superior force, the British Empire. The only way, because you're not going to win head-to-head combat on the battlefield, is guerrilla warfare, which inevitably leads into acts of terror and acts of violence against the citizenry and sort of ancillary players in the conflict, and it eventually goes to that level of fighting. It happened on both sides, and that kind of was what turned the tide against the British. So with all that being said, give me what was your reasoning? Because you definitely go into it in the Shadow War, but what was your reason for writing this book? You were like, okay, I'm picking terrorism as a political tool, and I'm going to write a full book on that. What was your reasoning behind the book?
I think terrorism was misunderstood in the Irish context. I think terrorism, if you were to walk down the street to with a microphone in your hand, and you would walk up to 100 Irish men and women today and say, I just want you to play name recognition or word recognition. I'm going to give you two names. What do you say? Terror and War of Independence. 99% of them would say black and tans and stop. And that's it.
Yeah.
And I think when you take a look at it, terror is not only, it's what you said, it's done by both sides. It's done intentionally by both sides. It's a strategy. It's not an ideology. It's what we intend to do. And we know what we're doing. We know that when we commit a terrorist act, there'll be a reprisal. There'll be some kind of, somebody come back at us. And we know that. And we know that the reprisal will get much more publicity than did the original act itself. The Irish clearly won the propaganda war at this particular time in the War of Independence. It was very, very clear that was the case. But what they wanted to do was they wanted the British to look bad, and they did. And so everything they did was with the intent of saying to the British, when you come back here and you come after us and you burn our homes, you burn our creameries, you share our women's hair, you do all the things that you're doing, that's going to be publicized worldwide, and the world is going to force something against you.
And that's and the black and tans, we'll get into that right now, but that is essentially, that was, in your view, is that when the English really started to incorporate terrorism into their whole strategy?
Well, yes and no. At the very start, the British said that there were authorized reprisals, or first of all, there were unauthorized reprisals, and then there were authorized reprisals. And as a matter of fact, one of the British MPs stood up in the House of, actually it wasn't an MP, he was in the House of Lords, and he stood up and he said, there is no such thing as reprisals, but they're working very, very well. The fact of the matter is they knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew how they worked, and they knew that this was a process, but they thought that they could intimidate, they thought they could bring fear to anybody. The concept of terror is an act against a few, which will have an effect against many. That's what all terror is, and that's exactly what they wanted to do.
Yeah, and so in the book you talk about it. Colonel Ormond Winter and the Cairo gang and all these that on the English side, and he was reviled. I mean, they could not stand him because he basically came to personify all those things that you were just talking about, right?
Yeah, he did. And as with many people, I think that they don't understand exactly who they are. The pictures of Ormond Winter, this is a man with the slicked back hair of the 1920s. You always see him with a picture. You may have even seen these. They still sell them. They're British Oval cigarettes. He's got it dangling in one thing, and he's got a monocle in the other. This looks like a bad person kind of thing. He was known as the Great Terror because he would come in and he would be involved in the beatings of people. And he set up aside, he was the head of intelligence after about 1919 in Dublin Castle. He came up with an idea. The Cairo gang was a group of people that they brought together. Again, it's hard to say. Some of the people did serve in Cairo, Egypt. Some of them did meet in the Cairo Cafe in Dublin. It's hard to say exactly where the name came from, but they were out there there were intelligence agents who came over and they wanted to get Michael Collins. Their thought was, if we can cut the head off of this snake, the rest of the snake will die. And they went out there to do that. So they did come in, and of course Collins knew exactly what they were doing. There was a lot of very bad tradecraft on the part of the British at the time. Many of these men were renting houses from an entity that rented to British soldiers and sailors and officials. Now, if you're looking for people, why wouldn't you look there? They weren't hiding. They weren't hiding in plain sight. They were demonstrating themselves in plain sight.
Yeah.
So on the morning of 1st of November, 1920, Collins put together a raid on 14 different places. There were 8 that were finally attacked. 14 British officers were killed. And then that afternoon, in reprisal, the British came into a Gaelic Athletic Association football game in Croke Park and killed 14 people by just shooting them and everything else. Now, many people have seen the movie Michael Collins. And in many ways, the movie is very good in terms of the tenor of the time. It also takes a tremendous amount of historical liberties. They did not drive an armored car into the center of Croke Park. But in fact, the Black and Tans did open fire. People were killed. And
Hey,
again,
Joe,
if you were,
real quick, before you even go any further, hold that thought for a second. You are talking about the famous Bloody Sunday massacre. Okay, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that that's what we're talking about right now, because that is famous. I mean, people know Bloody Sunday, or at the very least, they know that U2 sang a song about it.
no, they do, and U2 sang in that very stadium. The thing about it is this: if you take that same microphone and you walk a little further down the street and you say Bloody Sunday, everybody says Croke Park, afternoon, 14 people killed. Yeah. They don't even think at all about what happened to the British in the morning. Now, it's very important to note what happened to the British in the morning, not the fact that they were killed. That's obviously a very important factor. But the raid started at 9 o'clock. By 11 o'clock, the British soldiers who remained clogged the streets of Dublin trying to get into Dublin Castle. That's intimidation. That's terror. That's fear. That's exactly what they did. They took the rest of the intelligence agents and they put them in the Central Hotel in downtown Dublin. They were useless as intelligence agents thereafter. That's intimidation. That's what the Irish used their terror to do, and they worked very well. The British, they simply went after individuals. They simply went after people killing. The Bloody Sunday raid there in November of 1920 is still extremely important. And in fact, to this very day, there's the Hogan stand in Croke Park, which is named after one of the players who was killed on the field that day. So when you take a look at this, this is not something that goes away. There are a lot of people who probably know that Hogan was killed. They don't exactly know what the thing was. But again, Bloody Sunday to people is not morning, afternoon. It's afternoon only.
Yeah, yeah. And you go into that in your book, and this is a very important aspect of the War of Independence, was the intelligence apparatus that Michael Collins had kind of set up with the local civilians, the little girl, Miss Lily Mernon, and you know, just how he was able to incorporate just the local citizens just to keep an eye on what's going on with the English in the neighborhoods, because they, like you said, they were living within those people, within those neighborhoods.
There's everybody who was on the lookout, if you will. Lily worked for the English, and she'd put 2 carbons in, and so she would give one of the carbon to Collins, and she actually put together the addresses and things like that. They were young, and that's very important to understand here too. These people were very, very young. Collins was only 31 when he died, and he was considered an old man. Charlie Dalton was only 17, excuse me, when he went on one of these raids. He was on 17, and that night he came back and he was talking to his friends, and he said he couldn't sleep because he kept hearing the gurgling of the blood of the man that he shot that morning. And they said, no, it's just a faucet running upstairs. Charlie Dalton was involved in some tragic things of killing in the Civil War. He died himself as a paranoid schizophrenic. He had taken a hiding under his bed. He knew his enemies were coming after him. Sean Lamaze, who became the Taoiseach, the prime minister, he was on one of those raids. He was in his early 20s. He once said that on both sides they did terrible things and they knew it. Yeah. And then there was a young lieutenant. He was on the other side, Lieutenant Frederick Clark. He was in the Essex Regiment. He was a British one. And when he went back to England, what he wrote was, I didn't like myself much in Ireland, and I don't think anybody else did either. You've got young people thrust into extraordinarily, almost impossible to understand situations, all with guns in their hands.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard enough when it's for lack of a better word, when it's sanctioned violence, as in one army going against another army. It's a completely different thing when you're going after some English spy's family to take out the mother and the daughter, and you go into that. That's one of the chapters in your book that talked about the long-term trauma of the people that, not only the people that did those acts of violence, but also just the general population. I mean, that stuff doesn't go away anytime soon.
It doesn't. If you want to categorize it, I suppose there are three. There's those upon whom the violence was committed, those who commit the violence, and then everybody else. But everybody suffers. Everybody suffers all the way through. And they all suffer after the fact as well. That, there's a great deal of fear of hearing loud noises or somebody beating on the door, or hearing a backfire of a car or something like this.
Yep. Yep.
There were a great many women who had miscarriages, and just because of they were so afraid of what was going on at the time. A great many women had their hair shorn by both sides. The British shore the Irish women's hair because they were colluding with the IRA. The Irish shore their own women's hair because they were working in British offices. So what happens to everybody else who works in that office, who's now scared to death they're going to get their hair shorn off? Or what happens to the other woman who says, but I'm married to a man who's in the RIC? Everything is there. It's when you affect many by doing something to a few, that's what happens, and that's what terror is all about.
Yeah, and it seems like you said earlier, the propaganda aspect of a terror war is hugely important, because it seems like it was a tit for tat. The English, and then the Irish would do something, and the English would do something, and then it just keeps escalating. But it's whoever can get the outside observers to pick their side, because both sides have got their hands bloodied. So whoever can convince the outside world that they're the victim, I guess is probably the best way to put it, they're the ones that are going to win the propaganda war, which is what happened at the end when the English said this is an untenable position because of the backlash that we're getting from the international community.
That's exactly correct. And a tremendous amount of credit for that goes to the Irish propaganda machine. They were just simply better than the British, which is somewhat surprising. The British have been doing this kind of thing since Napoleon. I mean, they knew exactly what they were doing in terms of publicity and newspapers and everything. But the Irish were much, much better at it. And so when there would be they would have pictures all over the European press, the United States. And the United States, of course, at that time in the 1920s, had a huge Irish population, all of whom thought that the British were just terribly wrong in this. So what's been called since World War I, the special relationship, if you will, between U.S. and Great Britain that was established in World War I, that we still talk about today as being a special relationship. The British were worried as hell, as they should have been, about that relationship, which had just started. Is this going to do anything to us? There were no official sanctions, as we may talk about in a minute here. There were no official sanctions at the time, but many United States companies said, we will not deal with the British. And the British worried greatly about that. They worried greatly about the press. And so they tried to, they were forced in a way to come to the bargaining table, not militarily, but politically and propaganda-wise.
And that's specifically because of the terrorism that was going on, because that's the only way that that Irish could be at some level militarily with that occupying force. So it almost comes across, well, it definitely comes across as the bully beating up the little kid, and obviously that's about as simplistic as you can make it, but it's the larger force crushing the smaller one. And, does the smaller one actually deserve that?
Absolutely. And intentionally. Michael Collins said this is the only way a small nation can fight an empire. This was not something that they did, when they provoked some kind of a reaction. This was not a mistake. This was not something that they just did. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it very well.
Now, next question is, and I guess the answer historically is obviously it worked, but was Michael Collins able to convince the regular citizens of Ireland, hey, this could get ugly for a while. You guys just need to suck it up? I mean, is that because as it turns out in historically speaking, that the person that you are trying to intimidate through terror, generally speaking, it does the opposite. It coalesces a support around that person or that individual. So is that what happened? Did the people just say, okay, we're in the middle of something really ugly, we just got to get through it?
I think to some degree, yes, that's true, Brian. But remember, they had an election. After the treaty, they had an election in June of 1922. And a great many people, historians, look at this election and they say, well, this is anti-treaty versus treaty. And the pro-treaty people won a great many votes. So by the time you get to this point, By the time you get to the summer of 1921, you go through the treaty negotiations. By this point, the people wanted peace. And you see that an awful lot in world situations as well. We will accept something that was less than what we would have taken before, as long as the killing stops. And by this point, I think the 1921, 1922, both sides had realized the killing has got to stop. And I think Collins certainly realized this killing has got to stop. But that doesn't mean that we're going to stop trying to get the North or anything else. Yeah. Collins always spoke of the treaty as a stepping stone. It was the freedom to achieve freedom. He did not look at this as being the end all. If you use Winston Churchill's words, it wasn't the end of the beginning. It was the beginning of the end, rather. It was only the end of the beginning. He definitely wanted to get the North in there, and he was trying to. But for right now, let's take this and let's make ourselves a country, and then we'll start up again and do something else. But I think the people themselves wanted peace.
Yeah. And what is what are you trying to, for the person that reads this book, what are you trying to get across? And is it specifically to Ireland, or is it just terrorism in general?
Whenever I give talks and give lectures, I always say the same thing, and that's it. All guerrilla wars, particularly, and terror wars are different, but they're all alike. Again, if you're talking about the time that you served in Iraq, you could probably go through here and say, I saw that, I saw this, I saw that. You can see it. Unfortunately, we see this every day in the TV as we go today. The war in Ireland became one of tit for tat reprisals. That was exactly what was going on. That's what's going on right now, if you will, in Ukraine. You've got people who are the terror and the acts. They go on, and it's hard to say exactly will they ever end. In terms of, for this particular person, terror is a disproportionate punishment for everybody that's applied to a few people. And again, you take a look at this and you say, look what's happened in Bucha in Ukraine. It's exactly what's happening in Ireland, where they burn down a town or something. Right. It's unfortunately, it does not end. It ends in a certain place, but it does not end in the world. And each of them invited vengeance killings. Each side in Ireland invited vengeance killings, which is exactly what's happening in Ukraine. Again, each side is going to be involved in killing people on both sides. You take a look at the Black and Tans who go into Ireland, and that's a non-governmental entity. That's not the army. The army didn't like the Black and Tans in Ireland. They thought they were totally undisciplined. They were terrible. They were causing problems. They were causing problems for us. When the auxiliaries went into there, again, another sort of non-governmental entity, they made sure they wore those tam o'shanter hats because the army wanted to say, we want to make sure people's not thinking of us. What about the Wagner Group going into Ukraine today?
Yeah.
Is that a non-governmental entity that the Russians have to do a lot of their dirty work for them?
Yeah.
The same thing. Yeah. Unfortunately, this physical injury and this mental anguish that goes along with the terror war, individually, all this stuff can cripple. But when you take a look at it, now, the psychological trauma that continues afterwards is hugely important. And that's what we don't even address when the war is going on. We just try and get through it. The terror war in Ireland ended. The trauma didn't. The terror war in Ukraine, hopefully someday, will end. But the trauma won't. Yeah. It will go on for many, many years, generations even, because that's the nature of a terror war.
Yeah. And is it still how is it manifesting itself in Ireland today? Is it still there, or is it just kind of a little bit behind the scenes?
I don't think it's manifesting itself. I think it's not manifesting itself in this sense. When you had the 1916 uprising, there were commemorations all over the country. I spoke in several schools. I spoke, it was, remember, this was sort of the foundation of the Irish history. Now, COVID comes in and things change because the last couple of years with COVID there were not the commemorations that were of the War of Independence, because again, it gets a little bit dirty, it gets a little bit gray. But if you go back to 2010, for example, before COVID was ever even thought of, people looked at 2016, they looked at 2019, and they said, okay, these are how the commemorations are going to come back. Nobody knew what to do about the Civil War.
Yeah.
They did not know how in any way to commemorate it, to remember it, to not remember it. They didn't do anything. And COVID, in a sense, helped them through that because a lot of the things were not done.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at right now, as I say, you're looking at August 1922 is the 100-year anniversary of Collins's killing. Obviously, there'll be a great many things. I'll be over there speaking, and the people will be talking about what happened. It will certainly bring out some things. If you take a look, I mentioned Tom Barry earlier. He was one of the great flying column leaders in county court. In 1965, there was a monument to Michael Collins placed in his home, almost in his own home where he was born, the house where he was born, about 100 yards away. It's all owned by the family and everything else. It's a big, giant stone with a bas-relief of Michael Collins on it. The man who unveiled that particular monument and gave the oration at that time was Tom Barry. He was on the other side in the Civil War. And it was noted as being very important that Tom Barry would go there, even though he was hugely important in County Cork. He would go there and he would kind of try and bring people together. Yeah. So there are things trying to bring people together. That 65, obviously, we're looking at 60 years ago, but it's happening. People are trying to bring some reconciliation. In the North, they're trying to bring reconciliation for the things that happened in the 60s, 70s, and 90s. It's very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
And it's just a kind of a thing where both sides, it's a very raw wound in the North currently, and in the South, it's always sort of been a raw kind of a thing that is still sort of there.
Yeah. And when you do go over in August, do you what is planned? Do you know what's happening, or are you just going to be on kind of a speaking tour, or are there going to be big kind of events going on?
Well, I'll be speaking in Cork, for example, and I was fortunate to be asked to speak to the Collins family in Dublin Castle, and
wow.
I'll be speaking to historical societies, and I'll be speaking to in Glasnevin Cemetery. I'll be giving a presentation. So there'll be various things like this that are going on in terms of myself, but in terms of others, and certainly at Bale na Blah, which is the little corner in the road where Collins was killed, there'll be a huge commemoration down there at that particular time. But again, you take a look, and I think over the periods of the last 100 years, for a while, the government wouldn't allow the army to be there because it was the other side, it was the anti-treaty side who was in power, and then the army came back, and then the army didn't, and now the army is there. So it's a very, very kind of a touchy thing. I don't think that this commemoration of Collins will be touchy in any sense, because I think everybody recognizes Collins's value and the great loss that he was.
Yeah. Great. This was great, Joe. I really, really appreciate it. Yeah, it was
I appreciate it. I always have a great time. As I've said to you before several times, you're a great interviewer because you ask questions to which I know the answers. And so it's a great time, and I really appreciate it. And thank you.
Well, you obviously stayed up last night, because when we were going back and forth yesterday, you'd said, you're going to stay up late so I don't stump you.
I had to learn a few things, yeah.
No, it's fascinating. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the last time we talked, but when I traveled over to Ireland with my wife and two other couples several years ago, and we loved it. And my buddy just happens to be William Lynch, Bill. We were walking around Dublin, and just kind of on the outskirts of Dublin, and you'll know this better than I do, but there's that huge obelisk just outside the city. You can walk to it from the center of town. Well, going through, kind of walking back into the center of Dublin, we walked past a small little statue of Michael Collins. It's just basically a bust of Michael Collins in this little park. And, Bill goes up, and I take his picture, him and the statue. And in my ignorance, I had no idea. And so talking to you about it is fascinating, because that's filling in all that history of Ireland that I just have no idea about. So I love talking to you about it.
Well, that would have been a nice walk, because you were out in Phoenix Park when you went to the obelisk. That's Wellington Monument. Park. And the Wellington Monument is a tall obelisk like that. It's actually the second tallest in the world. The only one taller is the Washington Monument in D.C. And so that's quite a walk to go from city center Dublin, but it's a wonderful walk. And I've never heard anyone who went to Ireland on a trip and didn't have a marvelous time. It's a beautiful, beautiful country physically, but the people are just the friendliest and just the most, they're just the most helpful people, nice people you'll ever want to meet.
Yep. I totally agree. Alrighty, sir. Joe Connell, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so very much, Brian. Thank you.
Guy. You're welcome. And I'll finish off by saying, if you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. Joe Connell, it's been a pleasure as always.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
All right, guys, it's the Rain Man. Talk to you soon. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.